Have you ever wondered what happens when the kindest person you know finally stops trying? Not because they stopped loving, but because they've been pushed past silence, past understanding, past the version of themselves they thought they had to be. Carl Jung called it the return of the repressed, when what you bury deep inside to survive eventually rises to protect you. And when empath reaches that point, they don't fight. They don't scream. They don't collapse in dramatic fashion. They disappear, not out of weakness, but from a strength no one ever expected them to possess. That's when they become the most dangerous kind. You spent your whole life being told you're too sensitive. But what if I told you that the problem was never your sensitivity? What if the problem was a world that mistakes depth for weakness, empathy for unlimited availability, and emotional intelligence for emotional servitude? Empaths are profoundly misunderstood, not because they're mysterious or complex in some mystical way, but because their true strength is invisible until the moment it finally breaks free from the constraints they've placed on themselves. From the outside, you appear calm, soft, always there when someone needs a shoulder to cry on, an ear to listen, a heart to hold their pain. You become the person others call at 2 a.m. when their world is falling apart. But who calls you when yours does? You listen to problems that aren't yours to solve, carrying the weight of other people's choices like they're your responsibility. You hold space for emotions that others refuse to feel, becoming a container for their unexpressed grief, unprocessed anger, and unacknowledged fear. You forgive betrayals that would shatter most people's trust forever. You make excuses for behavior that you would never accept from yourself. You give chance after chance to people who've already shown you exactly who they are. You've made yourself a sanctuary for everyone else's pain, while your own goes unnoticed, unattended, unloved. Carl Jung described this profound imbalance as a split in the psyche, the unbearable tension between the persona we show the world and the shadow parts we exile to gain acceptance. For empaths, that persona is the eternal helper, the one who's always okay, always understanding, always giving from an apparently endless well of compassion. You've perfected the art of being fine when you're falling apart, of smiling through emotional starvation, of staying present during conversations that drain your life force, while pretending that listening to the same problems for the 100th time doesn't exhaust your soul. But beneath that carefully constructed mask of endless availability lives someone who's never felt fully held. Someone who carries the emotions others discard like they're personally responsible for the healing of everyone around them. Someone who's convinced themselves that being needed is the same as being loved, that being useful is the same as being valued. But it's not. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the conditioning and people-pleasing and emotional labor you've been taught to call love, you know it. Take a moment right now. When was the last time someone asked how you were doing and actually waited for a real answer? When was the last time someone held space for your pain the way you hold space for theirs? The truth is, you've been holding the emotional weight of your relationship for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to be carried instead of carrying. You've been so busy being everyone's safe harbor that you've forgotten you also deserve shelter from storm. You've been giving from an empty cup for so long that you can't remember what it felt like when it was full. You've been loving others more than you love yourself for so long that self-love feels foreign, selfish, wrong. And eventually, something inside begins to collapse, quietly, invisibly, completely. But what happens next isn't weakness. It's not a breakdown, though it might feel like one. It's the beginning of the most profound transformation you'll ever experience. It's your psyche refusing to fragment any longer. It's the dangerous awakening to your own worth. The shift doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It doesn't happen all at once in some dramatic moment of revelation. Instead, it begins in whispers, small changes that others dismiss as temporary stress, moodiness, or just going through a phase. You stop replying to texts immediately. Messages that once would have sent you into a spiral of anxiety about keeping others waiting now sit unread for hours, sometimes days. You let calls go to voicemail without that familiar pang of guilt. You withdraw from conversations that once consumed hours of your emotional energy. You no longer rush to fill uncomfortable silences or smooth over awkward moments. You stop laughing on cue or smiling to ease someone else's discomfort. Your body is present, but your soul has quietly stepped back, creating space between who you are and who you've been performing to be. This is what Jung called the tension of opposites, the unbearable psychological pressure of holding light and shadow, love and resentment, hope and disappointment, care and exhaustion all at once, until something inside simply cannot hold the contradiction anymore. Maybe you felt this tension. The way your body says yes while your soul screams no. The way you smile while something inside you dies a little more. Let me tell you about Sarah. She was 32, a social worker by profession and an emotional caretaker by compulsion. She was the friend everyone called during their 3 a.m. breakdown. The daughter who mediated every family conflict, absorbing the emotional shrapnel so others could walk away unscathed. The colleague who stayed late to help others meet their deadlines while her own projects suffered in silence. For 3 decades, Sarah held that tension. She believed with her whole heart that people could change if she just loved them enough, supported them enough, understood them enough. She believed her silence about her own needs was noble, generous, even spiritual. She wore her emotional availability like a badge of honor. But silence has a cost that compounds over time. Sarah's nervous system began speaking a language her mind refused to acknowledge. Chronic headaches that no amount of medication could touch. Insomnia that left her staring at the ceiling, her body exhausted, but her mind racing with everyone else's problems. A heaviness in her chest that felt like drowning in slow motion. Gasping for emotional air in relationships where she was always giving mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but never receiving it. Her body was screaming what her voice had been trained to whisper. The breaking point didn't come during a dramatic fight or obvious betrayal. It came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when her sister called, upset about the same relationship pattern they discussed hundreds of times before. The same toxic dynamic, the same excuses, the same request for Sarah to absorb the emotional chaos and transform it into wisdom. And for the first time in her life, Sarah felt nothing. Not anger. She'd moved past anger years ago. Not frustration. Frustration required the belief that things could change. Not even compassion, that well had finally run dry. Just a profound, crystalline clarity that seemed to come from the deepest part of her being. I'm done. Maybe you recognize this moment. The moment when caring stops feeling like love and starts feeling like self-abandonment. When empathy stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like a prison you've locked yourself inside. That moment marks the beginning of what Jung called the emergence of the shadow. Not the evil or dark parts of yourself, but the parts you've been taught to reject in order to be loved. The parts that can say no without guilt. The parts that can choose self-protection over self-sacrifice. The parts that refuse to set themselves on fire to keep others warm. Sarah's wall didn't build itself overnight. It rose slowly, brick by brick, constructed from every time she was overlooked in a conversation she was actively facilitating. Every time her gentleness was mistaken for weakness. Every time her availability was assumed rather than appreciated. Every time someone took her listening ear for granted while never offering their own. That wall doesn't scream or blame or demand apologies for past hurts. It doesn't need vindication or validation. It simply stands solid and unshakable between the person you were and the person you're becoming. And you stand behind it. Not afraid anymore, not guilty anymore, but finally unavailable to be used. This isn't cruelty. This isn't emotional shutdown or dissociation or any of the other words people will use to try to guilt you back into your old patterns. This is your nervous system finally saying what your voice never could. I've had enough. Jung understood that the psyche has a natural drive toward wholeness, toward integration. When we split ourselves, hiding our needs to maintain our relationships, suppressing our authentic responses to keep the peace, something inside begins pushing toward healing. toward reclaiming what we abandoned to be accepted. What part of yourself have you been silencing just to feel loved? What aspects of your authentic self have you buried so deep that you've almost forgotten they exist? The collapse isn't your weakness revealing itself. It's your strength finally refusing to hide anymore. It's your soul saying, I won't fragment any longer. I won't abandon myself for anyone else's comfort. I won't disappear just to make others feel whole. This is the beginning of becoming dangerous. This is the moment most people mistake for coldness. Friends, family members, romantic partners, they watch in confusion and often alarm as you stop performing emotional labor like it's your life's purpose. They call you distant, different, changed. They say you're not yourself anymore, which is ironic because you're actually becoming more yourself than you've ever been. They want the old you back, the one who absorbed their chaos and called it care, who translated their dysfunction into compassion, who made their emotional immaturity feel like someone else's responsibility. But in Jungian psychology, what's happening isn't coldness or cruelty. It's something far more profound and, yes, infinitely more dangerous to those who benefited from your previous patterns of self-abandonment. It's shadow integration. For most of your life, you've carried what Jung called the persona, the mask of the perpetual giver, the eternal helper, the one who exists primarily to serve others' emotional needs. This persona was likely formed in childhood, when you learned that love was conditional on your ability to make others comfortable, to be what they needed rather than who you were. But every persona has a shadow, and for empaths, that shadow contains all the self-protection, healthy boundaries, and life-preserving selfishness that you've been taught to reject as bad or selfish or unloving. Sarah's integration began the day she stopped explaining herself. Her sister called again, expecting the usual emotional support session that had become their relationship's primary currency. The familiar pattern: crisis, call Sarah, dump the emotional chaos, feel better, hang up, repeat in 2 weeks. But instead of the familiar, tell me everything. I'm here for you. Sarah said something that would change everything. I'm not available for this conversation right now. No justification. No elaborate explanation about why she couldn't carry someone else's pain in that moment. No apology for having boundaries. No offer to schedule a better time. Just a simple, clear statement of her current reality. Her sister was shocked into silence. Then came the predictable response. You're being selfish. I need to talk to someone. What's wrong with you? And for the first time in her 32 years of life, Sarah replied, yes, I'm being selfish, and there's nothing wrong with me. That yes is the most dangerous word an empath can learn to say. Because once you stop being driven by the desperate fear of losing someone, you're moved by something deeper and infinitely more powerful. The absolute refusal to lose yourself anymore. You stop explaining your boundaries to people who never respected them in the first place. You stop proving your worth to those who took it for granted while they had unlimited access to it. You stop performing the role of the understanding one, the available one, the one who exists to make others comfortable with their own emotional immaturity. This is what Carl Jung called individuation. The process of becoming whole by embracing and integrating the parts of yourself you once rejected in order to be loved. The parts that can say no without drowning in guilt. The parts that can choose silence over explaining yourself to people who are determined to misunderstand you. The parts that can walk away from love that requires you to disappear. Think about this. How many relationships in your life would survive if you stopped being the one who always gave more, cared more, tried more? Once this integration begins, once you start reclaiming the parts of yourself you exiled to be accepted, you become dangerous. Not because you hurt others, but because you can no longer be hurt in the same ways that once controlled you. You're no longer baited into arguments that go nowhere and resolve nothing. You're no longer seduced by potential that exists only in your imagination. You're no longer moved by apologies that are offered without the behavioral changes to back them up. You've walked through the fire of your own emotional abandonment and discovered something incredible. You didn't burn. Instead, you were reforged into something stronger, clearer, more authentically yourself than you ever thought possible. Others notice the change immediately, and their reactions tell you everything you need to know about the true nature of your previous relationships. Some people panic. They escalate their demands for your attention, your emotional labor, your availability. They guilt you, manipulate you, remind you of all the times they needed you. They cannot fathom a version of you that prioritizes your own well-being. Others simply disappear, without your willingness to be their emotional dumping ground. They discover they have no genuine interest in you as a person. The relationship was never mutual. It was extractive. But a precious few, those who truly love you rather than just needing you, celebrate your transformation. They've been waiting for you to value yourself the way they value you. The way you no longer rush to fill uncomfortable silences in conversations. The way you let their emotions belong to them instead of absorbing them as your own. The way you choose your own peace over their temporary comfort. To those who are using you, it feels like loss. To you, it feels like coming home to yourself after a lifetime of living in exile. This is what Jung meant when he spoke about the transcendent function. The ability to hold the tension between opposites until a new way of being emerges. You're still loving, still kind, still deeply feeling and empathetic. But now those qualities flow from fullness rather than emptiness. From conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. From strength rather than the terror of being alone. You love people, but you no longer love them more than you love yourself. You care about their well-being, but you no longer care more about their comfort than your own peace. You're willing to help, but you're no longer willing to drown in order to save someone who refuses to learn to swim. When did you first realize that being needed wasn't the same as being valued? That being useful wasn't the same as being loved? This is the birth of the dangerous empath. Dangerous to the systems that required your self-sacrifice to function. Dangerous to the relationships that fed on your depletion. Dangerous to the cultural narrative that equates feminine strength with endless giving. You become dangerous to anyone who mistakes your kindness for weakness, your empathy for availability, your love for something they can take without reciprocation. People don't fear the empath when they're giving everything. They fear them when they stop giving anything that isn't freely chosen. Because the person who once absorbed their anxiety like a sponge now reflects it back to them like a mirror. The person who once translated their chaos into compassion now lets that chaos speak for itself. The person who once made excuses for their behavior now simply observes it without rushing to fix or explain it away. This terrifies those who built their emotional stability on your instability, their comfort on your willingness to be uncomfortable, their peace on your acceptance of chaos. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For the empath, that moment of authentic becoming is quiet but irreversible. It's not announced with fanfare or justified with lengthy explanations. It simply is. Sarah's family noticed the change at their next holiday gathering. For 20 years, she had automatically assumed the role of emotional mediator, smoothing over conflicts before they could escalate, absorbing the family's dysfunction and transforming it into forced harmony. But this time, when her uncle made his usual passive-aggressive comment about her mother's cooking, and her mother responded with barely concealed hurt disguised as martyrdom, Sarah did something unprecedented. She continued eating her dinner. She didn't jump in to translate the subtext. She didn't rush to soothe her mother's wounded feelings or gently redirect her uncle's criticism. She didn't perform the familiar dance of emotional triage that had become her assigned role in every family interaction. She let the discomfort exist in the space between them. The silence stretched, thick with unprocessed emotion and unspoken resentment. Everyone looked at Sarah expectantly, waiting for her to wave her magic wand of understanding and make everything okay again. But Sarah had retired her magic wand. She was no longer available to transform other people's emotional immaturity into functional communication. "Sarah seems different," her aunt whispered to her mother later, loud enough for Sarah to hear. Cold, distant, not like herself, but Sarah wasn't cold. For the first time in her life, she was actually warm toward herself. This is what makes the integrated empath so threatening to systems built on emotional labor extraction. You begin protecting your peace more fiercely than you ever protected your image. You no longer translate other people's chaos into your own sense of responsibility. You feel their discomfort without making it your emergency to resolve. You start choosing solitude over performance, authenticity over acceptance, your own approval over their validation. You develop what I call selective empathy. You can still feel deeply, but you're no longer compelled to act on every feeling. You can sense someone's pain without automatically assuming it's your job to heal it. You can witness someone struggle without drowning in it alongside them. To outsiders, especially those who benefited from your previous patterns of self-abandonment, this looks like cruelty. But to those who've lived through emotional starvation while feeding everyone else, this is what self-respect looks like. This is psychological sovereignty. You're no longer waiting to be chosen by others because you've already chosen yourself. Let me tell you about Marcus, another example of this transformation. He was the friend who always picked up the check, always offered his couch to friends going through breakups, always said yes to plans even when he was exhausted. His apartment became a revolving door of people who needed something: money, a place to stay, emotional support, practical help. Marcus measured his worth by his usefulness to others. He equated love with being needed, friendship with being available, goodness with never saying no. But chronic giving from an empty cup eventually broke something inside him. Not his capacity for love, but his willingness to love people more than they love themselves. The shift came when a friend asked to borrow money for the 5th time in 6 months. Money that had never been repaid for emergencies that seemed to occur with suspicious regularity. Instead of his usual immediate yes, Marcus found himself saying no. Just that. No explanation about his own financial situation. No apology for having boundaries. No counteroffer or alternative solution. Just no. His friend was stunned. "But I thought you cared about me," they said, weaponizing Marcus's compassion against him. "I do care about you," Marcus replied. "But I care about me too now." That's the line that changes everything. "But I care about me too now." This level of emotional maturity is threatening to a world built on people-pleasing, codependency, and the exploitation of empathetic hearts. When you stop participating in relationships where you're expected to be smaller to make others comfortable, people notice. When you stop engaging with individuals who mistake your boundaries for betrayal, they escalate their demands for access to your energy. When you stop explaining your worth to those who are determined not to see it, they call you arrogant, selfish, changed. But here's what they don't understand. You haven't become cruel. You become unavailable for cruelty, both giving it and receiving it. You no longer participate in the cultural gaslighting that calls healthy boundaries selfishness and emotional self-protection coldness. You no longer buy into the narrative that your worth is measured by your willingness to suffer for others' comfort. Have you noticed how differently people treat you when you stop being available to fix their problems? How some relationships simply evaporate when you're no longer willing to be the one who gives more, cares more, tries more. This isn't about becoming heartless. It's about having a heart that finally belongs to you first. You still love, but you love from a place of conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. You still care, but you care without sacrificing your own well-being on the altar of someone else's temporary comfort. You've become fluent in the language of discernment. You can sense the difference between someone who genuinely values your presence and someone who simply wants access to your energy. Between someone who loves you and someone who loves what you do for them. And you honor that discernment above all else, even when it means disappointing people who've grown accustomed to your self-abandonment. This is what makes you dangerous in the most beautiful way possible. In the end, the fed-up empath is not vengeful or bitter or closed off from love. They are free. Free from the exhausting performance of being who others needed them to be instead of who they actually are. Free from the constant anxiety of managing everyone else's emotions while neglecting their own. Free from the crushing weight of believing that their worth was measured by their usefulness to others rather than their inherent value as a human being. Sarah, 3 years into her transformation, lives a life that would be completely unrecognizable to her former self. She has friends who reciprocate her energy instead of draining it. She has boundaries that are respected rather than constantly tested and pushed. She has learned to feel deeply without drowning in others' emotions, to love fully without losing herself in the process. She still works as a social worker, but now she approaches her clients from a place of professional compassion rather than personal rescue fantasies. She can hold space for their pain without absorbing it into her own body. She can care about their outcomes without taking responsibility for their choices. Her romantic relationships have transformed completely. She's no longer attracted to people who need fixing or saving. She's drawn to emotional equals, people who can match her depth without requiring her to be their therapist, their mother, or their emotional support system. The man she's dating now was initially confused by her self-possession. "You're so independent," he said early in their relationship, and she could hear the slight complaint in his voice, the unconscious expectation that love meant having unlimited access to her emotional labor. "Yes," she replied simply. "I am." He had to decide whether he wanted to love her or control her, whether he was interested in partnership or possession. Fortunately, he chose love. This is what Carl Jung called the individuated self, a soul no longer split between pleasing others and honoring themselves. You've turned your pain into discernment, your silence into a sanctuary, every wound into a boundary that protects rather than punishes. The dangerous empath is not dangerous because they become cruel or vindictive or closed-hearted. They're dangerous because they can no longer be used, manipulated, or exploited. They are dangerous because they've reclaimed their softness and paired it with an unshakable sense of self-worth. They've learned that real love doesn't require you to be less than you are. That healthy relationships don't drain you of your life force. That your sensitivity is not a character flaw to be managed, but a superpower to be honored and protected. You've discovered the difference between being loving and being available, between being kind and being exploitable, between being empathetic and being a dumping ground for others' unprocessed emotions. In a world that preys on softness, that mistakes gentleness for weakness and kindness for unlimited availability, the person who reclaims their softness with wisdom becomes untouchable. Not because they're hard or closed off, but because they're whole. You become the light that no longer needs permission to shine. You radiate not because someone gives you validation, but because that's your nature when you're not dimming yourself for others' comfort. The integrated empath loves more purely because they love from choice rather than compulsion. They give more meaningfully because they give from overflow rather than emptiness. They connect more deeply because they're no longer trying to disappear into others to avoid the discomfort of being themselves. This is your individuation. This is your return to self. This is your dangerous awakening to your own immeasurable worth. You're not the empath who breaks under the weight of others' expectations. You are the empath who broke free from those expectations and discovered your own strength. You're not the one who loves until there's nothing left of themselves. You're the one who learned that the most loving thing you can do is remain whole while loving others. You're not the one who gives themselves away piece by piece until they disappear. You're the one who learned that your presence is the gift, not your absence from your own life. What would change in your life today if you truly believed, not just intellectually, but in your bones, that you are worthy of the same love, care, and consideration that you give so freely to others? The world desperately needs empaths, but it needs empaths who know their worth, who can feel deeply without losing themselves in the feeling, who can love fully without abandoning their own hearts in the process, who can give generously without giving themselves away. Your journey through the shadow, through the integration, through the dangerous awakening to your own value. This isn't just personal healing. This is a radical act of love for a world that's forgotten what healthy relationships look like. You become the living example, the walking proof, the breathing demonstration that it's possible to be soft and strong simultaneously, loving and boundaried, generous, and self-protective. In becoming dangerous to those who would use you, you become safe for those who would truly love you. You become a beacon for other empaths who are still drowning in their own compassion, still believing that love means self-sacrifice, still confusing their worth with their willingness to suffer for others. Your transformation gives them permission to value themselves. Your boundaries show them what self-respect looks like. Your refusal to abandon yourself teaches them that they don't have to abandon themselves either. In a world hungry for authentic connection, for relationships built on mutual respect rather than exploitation, for love that heals rather than depletes, your particular brand of dangerous safety is exactly what we need. You're not too much. You never were. You're not too sensitive, too emotional, too caring. You are perfectly calibrated for a world that desperately needs the medicine of conscious empathy. Empathy given from choice, not compulsion. The dangerous empath is not the one who stops feeling. They're the one who feels everything and chooses their responses consciously. They're the one who loves from fullness rather than need. They're the one who has learned that the greatest act of service is becoming who they truly are. Your journey to wholeness matters, not just for you, but for everyone who will benefit from your authentic, boundaried, consciously loving presence in this world.